So why Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the best form of money that we have, and it's outperforming the blue line, which is S&P 500, and the yellow line at the bottom, which is gold. So it's definitely important for every country to have Bitcoin because there is a large potential for Bitcoin to grow. It's effectively an asymmetric bet. So this is my projection. I'm using 60% median annual growth for Bitcoin price appreciation. And I don't know if you can read the chart, but in 10 years' time, we should be at $7 million per coin. So this is a conservative projection, and I think it's probably going to be higher than this. But if this is what comes to pass, then I think you should have some Bitcoin. So this is just comparing two models. The orange line is my model, 60% median growth. The blue line is Saylor's Bitcoin 24 model, but I think he's underestimating the growth potential. So there is also a inflow to market cap relationship between money that's coming into Bitcoin and the price appreciation. So in 2021, the Bank of America extrapolated that $93 million of inflows would be required to increase the market, the Bitcoin price by 1%. And if you work backwards, which some people did, it comes out to 118 times multiplier. So $1 increases market cap by $118. And it goes to show that the potential to increase is much lower for Bitcoin than it is for gold or treasuries. But I think that is a bit high. I think it might be more conservative to estimate with a 20x multiplier. But there is a multiplier, and that's the main point. Basically, if if you wanted to buy 245,000 Bitcoin, the market cap you'll add 15 billion, but you'll increase market cap by 300 billion. So the point of this is that to buy back the Bitcoin that was sold is going to be more and more difficult, especially with competition to other countries that are mining or buying Bitcoin. Well, my model is actually very simple. It's just 60% median growth every year. And if you go back 5 to 10 years, roughly you see the same trajectory. But one thing that most models don't account for is that there will be a point at which people just stop using fiat currencies. So we can project out 10 years, 20 years, but the reality is we're probably not going to go to 20 million a coin. And eventually, at some point, we'll just use Bitcoin as the unit of account. So with money, you have three parts of paths to evolution: store of value, unit of account, medium of exchange. So unit of account right now is still the dollar. Even countries that don't use the dollar, their currencies are pseudo-pegged to the dollar or directly pegged to the dollar. But eventually, we'll just price things in Satoshis, which is the smallest unit of Bitcoin. Well, I think ultimately, everyone is going to use Bitcoin. It's either you accept it or you wait until you have no choice because the person you want to buy bread from doesn't want a euro anymore. So at that point, do the regulations really matter? It's just near term, I think you can have good regulations or bad regulations, but the legal tender law I don't think is really legal tender even in El Salvador because merchants are not forced to accept it. Larger companies are accepting it because they want to make sure they follow the letter of the law. But by and large, most people don't accept Bitcoin yet in El Salvador even, and they're not forced to. So if I go to a business and I say I want to pay in Bitcoin, they say no, I can't call the police. I don't think anyone's going to enforce that. And I think the deregulation path of Argentina is probably more practical, just saying just use whatever you want. And you can use Bitcoin as money. And there is no barrier there. There's no taxation on it because you shouldn't be taxed on using money to buy daily goods. And I think places like Switzerland are okay as well because there is no capital gains tax. So you can, for example, in Lugano, just spend Bitcoin and buy whatever you want. And it's just treated as money too. And there was no regulation needed for that as well. So I guess it depends really on if there is anything currently prohibiting, because some countries don't allow people to use Bitcoin for payments as well. So either you need to amend that or make a new regulation saying, yes, Bitcoin can be used. So it's very different per country, but I think the countries that we are focused on are more in the developing world, and they are seeking economic growth and investment. So for them, it's not really worrying about all these things that maybe Europeans worry about, but they just want money to come in. And if Bitcoin is an avenue for that, then they will welcome that.
Right now we see the nation states issue a lot of debt and they just consume it, right? They put it into consumption, like social security, give it to people, whatever. Have you actually had in your encounters with different governments, like literally like told them, hey, why don't you just, you're issuing your debt anyway, you could easily buy an asset with it, and that asset goes in your books, and you could still use that as a collateral to issue essentially the same amount of debt that you had before, but now you also have the asset. Is that something that people are receptive for? Do they get it, or do they think like, wait, that's like, how can we?
I don't think they get it yet. So when I speak about Bitcoin bonds, it's just, issue the debt and buy Bitcoin, not to leverage the Bitcoin to do anything with it. I think that's more sophisticated, and that's probably more in the realm of Michael Saylor and his clever financial engineering. But I think if a country did issue debt to buy Bitcoin and just held it, that is already good enough, and that could eliminate most of their debt. At least that was the idea for El Salvador. In a world where everyone is transacting in Bitcoin directly, would anyone want that fractional backed currency, or would they be forced to use it, which is also the case too with a lot of fiat currencies too. I just don't see it surviving in the long run. I guess it has to do with human motivation. Like, which government in the world doesn't want something that's valuable? Like, I remember seeing a comic book or comic strip. It was this elf or something that has he's collecting bottle caps. And then the taxman goes to him and says, pay your taxes. And he says, I don't use your money. I have bottle caps. And then the taxman says, he pauses and then he says, give me those bottle caps. So if Bitcoin is valuable, states are going to want it one way or another. And right now, as you saw, the bulk of the holdings are from seizures, from criminal activities. But in the future, that could change to mining, because if you look at it, at least the way I look at it, is a state is basically, they're the homeowner association. They operate the land and they have all the energy, and they can direct that to do different things, like mining Bitcoin. So they could mine it for themselves. And we already see that there is a potential for Bitcoin mining to balance grids. And if you're going to nuclear, you have a very large base load already that you need to consume. So why not mine Bitcoin with it? So eventually, there is no such thing as a mining company. It's just an energy company, and they all mine. And if they all mine, then and they're state-owned, then the state can produce its own Bitcoin. But I think the key is that we are engaging to make sure that if there are policies that come out, it's not bad policies, and there are protections in place to ordinary Bitcoin holders, rather than letting policies go unchecked. Like we talked about the self-custody and those issues there. If there was no pushback, that could have gone through. So it's just a question of, if you think engagement and intervention is a net good or a net negative, but I think it's a net good, because education is never bad one way or another.
Can you please tell a little bit more of El Salvador that is close to issuing Bitcoin bonds?
From the time we brought it up and proposed it, it was about 2 or 3 months. So relatively quick, but they haven't issued it yet. So from thinking that they want to do it to execution, it's been a few years, I think. But it's hard to say the reason why it's delayed. It could be pressure from the IMF or other agencies. But we know at least the IMF doesn't like their Bitcoin law or their adoption of Bitcoin, period. The competition is really with the developing world at this point, right? The developing world is trying to divert a river of capital in, whereas developed or first world countries are more concerned about counting the droplets of rain that are landing on their country. So I think it'll come to a head in the next 2 to 3 years because of outflow of capital. And the challenge is you cannot control money at this point because of Bitcoin. So it's the realization of that and the acceptance of that, but I don't know when.
Basically, it comes down, what you're saying, just so I understand correctly, then it's kind of this movement that goes ahead because people just use it, whether they're allowed or not. So at a certain point, the state has to kind of deal with it. So the state wouldn't have an inherent incentive to say, okay, we have an advantage other than, for example, storing money in it or seeing that the value rises.
Yeah, I would say so.
As I understand Bitcoin, it levels the playing field on the rules of money. And I think that's a good thing. So how or why do you think educating people that have the power right now in this reality to abuse the rules of money to their own advantage, why do you think educating them on this revolutionary tool is beneficial to all of us and not just to the people who might take their power to abuse the current rules to gain an unfair advantage in the new world we're all trying to get into?
Well, good question. Well, I think people that want to abuse the rules and abuse their power are going to do so anyways. And I think Bitcoin can change people for the better. So if you take two people as a test and you give one of them, and both want to abuse power, and you give one of them Bitcoin, it's more likely that the one that you educated and got into Bitcoin is going to change because they understand at least the Bitcoin ethos and maybe sound money. But the more important thing is that with Bitcoin, you can't really abuse the system because the system treats everyone equally. So even if you're impoverished and you're unbanked, you have the same ability to acquire Bitcoin as Michael Saylor. I think that is the more important thing, just getting it into the hands of people. So, for example, El Salvador, they adopted Bitcoin, and maybe they have like 500,000 people using it, or 300,000. It's estimated, but at least those 300,000 people now have access to Bitcoin. Whereas if they didn't adopt it, then it'd be zero or close to zero. So I think, again, you have to take the good with the bad. So if a government accepts it and they endorse it, then the people are going to benefit and they are going to have Bitcoin, which levels the playing field, I think, at the end of the day. We have a significant amount of wealth in the hands of Bitcoiners now. So it is changing the game.
Could Bitcoin be the peace currency?
I think Bitcoin defunds wars. It's difficult to finance a war if you actually have to go to people that have custody of the asset or the money. It's easy to finance a war if you can print the money. And it's the same for everything. Most government policies are not of the will of the people. And I'm from Canada, so I can tell you, we didn't want to buy the vaccines, but the government bought the vaccines. We didn't want the $84 million app that you use to register when you enter and leave the country, but they did that anyway. So if they had to ask and collect the money for that, no one would give them the money for that. And it's the same with financing war. So I believe Bitcoin will usher in an age of peace because the people that are corrupt that want war won't be able to finance the war. So the impact of the war, probably markets would tank and Bitcoin will go down, but eventually Bitcoin will go back up because Bitcoin is likely going to be the only financial network that is going to be operating if there is full-blown war and sides are split up and lines are drawn across the board. One thing that people seem to forget is that financial systems don't work during wartime. You can't send money to anybody, and it depends on where you are and what app you're using, but probably a lot of them won't work. Venmo probably won't work. PayPal probably won't work. So everyone will just end up using Bitcoin. And bank balances will disappear for some reason or other. Maybe a bank data center is hit. So Bitcoin will be the only thing that functions at the end of the day. So I think I don't think there is a political risk. Any country that has a strong reserve of Bitcoin or large reserve of Bitcoin will be in a good position. The political risk might be, people come to Germany to ask for financing. But I think having Bitcoin is de-risking because if you have gold then you're at risk of seizure of the gold, especially if you have the gold in your own territory. So I was in Taiwan recently and I was meeting with some politicians there. They have 400 something tons of gold, 422, I believe, and it's just sitting under a mountain. But you can see there is a serious risk there. If Taiwan was invaded and you want to mount a resistance, but your gold is taken, how exactly do you finance the resistance? So Bitcoin is actually superior in terms of national defense because you can just have it in multi-sig wallet. And even the keys don't even need to all be in the country. It could be scattered. So strategically, in terms of military defense, it definitely is very pragmatic to have Bitcoin reserves.